Our session outcomes for today include that you would be able to describe how classroom management practices actually support kids who have been impacted by trauma. Just as a reminder, trauma is always defined by the person experiencing it. We never say what's traumatic for someone else. It's our response to an event, and all of our responses may be different. So it's just super important to keep that in mind. I'm hoping that when you leave, you will start to work on an action plan about how to integrate this into classroom practices. And I'm going to show you an assessment. So the 3 things in Amy language would be, I want you to remember that if you have good, solid classroom management or classroom practices in place that are evidence-based, you're really on your way to being a trauma-informed classroom. And I want you to recognize that we all need to assess an action plan in order to get these in place. So that's kind of where my head is. Again, I added the slides up front about where you could find the information. So I'm going to start with a little bit of foundation about where I'm coming from when we have this session together. So let's get a little grounded. So supporting youth in staff mental health is everybody's job. So being in our job now means, any of our jobs in education, now means that we all have to take on mental health support for everybody we're working with. It doesn't mean we're all doing therapy or counseling, but it means that we all recognize mental health and mental wellness, and we recognize when people need more support. That was fancy, I forgot that was there. So to integrate mental health into our current system is our job. We need to make sure that these things aren't separate. I'm not sure if I've mentioned that yet today, but all of this needs to go within our multi-tiered level supports. So we're gonna just keep remembering that it's our job to make sure it's integrated. So today we spend time on classroom practices, and I wanna make sure that you know that you don't wanna have a trauma team, a universal team, a classroom practice team, a restorative team. You want to have a team with experts on the team who are able to look at all of this and integrate the work. So it's our job as educators to remember we're always on the edge of misunderstanding a kid's behavior and that every interaction matters. So this is really hard. This is a really hard task, but it is our job to not make kids' mental health worse. We have to be ready, probably through self-care practices, to not take behavior personally, even when it feels personal. Behavior from kids isn't personal. It's not about us, and we have to remember that we're always on the edge of taking it personally. We know from Bruce Perry's research that every interaction you have with a kid matters. You can change the way a kid's brain is developing with 15-second interactions that are positive. So we just can't underestimate the power of our interactions. And it is our job to deal with their primary pain without inflicting secondary pain through punitive and controlling reactions. So another way to say that is, it's our job to know and remember that punitive consequences are not what's going to change the behavior of a kid who has chronic behavior problems. Punitive consequences aren't going to work, or we would never talk about behavior because we've had years of punitive consequences and they didn't change the behavior. They didn't teach the skill the kid was missing. So we want to do this without making it worse. And I don't think anybody makes it worse on purpose, but we have to be aware that we could unintentionally make things worse for kids. So we have to reflect on our own behavior, which we talked about this morning, because our personal state of mind is part of strong classroom practices. Our personal state of mind, how we are when we walk in a building, matters. How we are internally matters when we're dealing with kids, especially kids who've experienced trauma. And I think one of the biggest pieces of all of this work around kids who've experienced trauma is it's our job to stay regulated when kids aren't. It's our job to stay calm when kids aren't calm. It's our job to help de-escalate kids so they can learn and make good decisions. That is just part of our job now. And really, I think we're at that point where if we're not buying into the notion that mental health is everybody's job and that we have to stay regulated when kids don't, we might not be in the right place anymore, because that's the world we're living in. And we have to make sure that we're not making things worse unintentionally. So it is our job to stay calm when they're not. I think it's super important to remember you have to work in a culture, in a building or a district that is supportive of self-care in order to be able to really follow these ideas. So what I mean by that is you staying regulated all the time is humanly impossible. Who does that? No one. But you realizing you're not regulated and saying to someone, I need 2 minutes in the bathroom by myself, or I'm gonna like smother someone, you need to be able to say that without fear of judgment and fear of shame and fear of evaluation. You need to be able to say to your principal, like, I don't want him back in my room. I know he's coming back in my room. Just give me 2 or 3 minutes. Like, you need to be able to say those things because it is our job. And it's really hard. It's a really hard thing to ask anyone to do. And I think that we see that kind of, we've connected things back to equity. I think we see that in our equity conversations, young Black males are 21 more times likely to be killed by a police than their white counterpart. That was just within a 2-year span in the around 2010 and 2012 through 2012. So we not only have to expect this of our educators, we have to expect this of our public servants. It's our job to understand different cultures, different races, and it is our job to stay calm as best we can. And when we can't stay calm, it's our job to get ourselves out of that position temporarily. So I just want you to know that I think that this self-regulation piece is really crucial. And the definition of self-regulation basically means that you can manage your own emotions when things aren't going well, that you can do that. We know that when kids, like this kid here in whose belly is showing, we know that when kids are impulsive and they're acting out and they refuse to cooperate and they're acting hostile, first of all, we know that it's just our tendency to take that personally. And we also know it's not personal. So we have to have a level of self-awareness, because if a teacher or educator of any kind feels attacked or personally disrespected, that teacher is going to go into their stress response, the fight or flight or freeze response. And what's going to happen is, because they're functioning in the lower part of their brain, they're going to accept the challenge, like, bring it. They may not say that, but they may posture like that. And then the kid gets further in their downstairs brain. And just as a reminder, when you function from your downstairs brain, you can breathe, blink, your blood pressure is controlled. And your brain will tell you to fight, flight, or freeze if there's a bear, or if you're about to get hit by a bus, or you're in a dangerous situation. The only thing, that's what your lower part of your brain does. Your upper brain is where you make clear decisions, and you can be creative, and you can think, that's not personal, that's behavior. And if we don't, then we accept the challenge and the kid accepts the challenge, and then we feel more threatened, and then we're just in this cycle of dysregulation. So I think that we could aspire to being in a building and in a culture where not only can we talk about this before it happens, but we can talk about it after it happens. So in alternative school, the alternative school where I worked, we debriefed almost every day, not every day, but almost every day at the end of the day, because it was a stressful place to work. And people would get caught up in kid behavior, and we needed to get things cleared up because our job is to stay regulated and to come back the next day and the kids should get a fresh start. That's what we do in public education. So if we aren't addressing this regulation issue, classroom practices might as well go out the window, because this has to be the foundation of all of that work. So just as a reminder, I think I just said this 100 times, but we have to be regulated first. In case you weren't in the last session that I did, it is humanly impossible for me to be dysregulated, meaning functioning from the lower part of my brain, and get you, if you're in your lower part of your brain, it's humanly impossible. My lower brain can't get your brain to calm down and regulate in upstairs brain. It's just humanly impossible. So we have to get up here, calm, regulated space in order to get kids that way. So you can do all the proximity you want, and you can do all of the behavior specific praise you want, but if you aren't regulated, it's really not going to matter. So if you could just in your head, reflect a little bit about what strategies you use in your life to stay regulated and what you use in the classroom. There are lots of questions here, and I hope that if you take any of this material and use it with your staff, that you would have time to ask all of these questions and really process them, because I think they're really worth the time, because they bring out all kinds of feelings and kind of implicit biases and shame that goes on in buildings that we have to get addressed. So with classroom practices, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the way we've laid out classroom practices at Midwest, but we have laid out these practices into 6 different sections. So here's what I want you to know. If you Google evidence-based classroom practices, like 16 bajillion things are going to come up, because there are a lot of evidence-based practices. We've picked these because they float to the top every time. And we can really crosswalk them with being trauma-informed and really bring all of this together. So we know that we have to address what our physical environment looks like. When we're talking about being trauma-informed, one example of that is, don't put the kid in foster care next to the kid who's demonstrating bullying behaviors. Don't do that. That's not safe. That's not going to help the kid in foster care learn. That's going to help the kid in foster care be on a heightened sense of alert. How we set up our rooms matters. If Kate's the kid who demonstrates a lot of physical acting out behavior, does the kid who we know is acting as if there is some abuse that we haven't figured out yet, does that kid have to walk right by Kate every day? Like, we have to think about how these kids are positioned. And we have to have rules and expectations and routines clearly defined. I'm going to give you some examples of that. We know we have to have active supervision. If I were queen of the world, we would regularly ask what active supervision is looking like when we've had a crisis in our building. I did an observation about a year ago, and I was watching them line up and walk into the classroom, and the teacher went first, which I totally understand. And the kid at the end bolted. And it's not good the kid bolted, right? We know that a kid who bolts, what do they call it? Elope. This district called it eloping. We know if kids elope that they're probably in their stress response, that fight, flight, or freeze, and they're probably functioning from their downstairs brain. And there wasn't anybody with eyeballs on him. And so it's not about shaming and blaming. It's just about, okay, is there something we could have done in that environment to prevent that one behavior? We can't always do it. It's impossible. But could we do it and really be reflective about it? And then the next one is that we have strategies about how we encourage appropriate behavior. And then we have strategies for how we deal with inappropriate behavior. And then we have ways that we engage kids and give them the opportunity to respond. So what I want you to know is that on the Midwest website, under Tier 1, under Classroom Practices, there is a module for each one of these practices, a single sheet that summarizes each of these with the research on it that you could use with your staff, and a PowerPoint explaining them that you can use with your staff, and a self-assessment tool that you can use with your staff. So let's go a little bit further. So when we look at those classroom practices, they are all lined up with what a trauma-informed classroom looks like. So I'm not going to read all of these to you, or we'll be here way too long, but I do want you to know that they're in here, and I hope that you'll go back and check them out. Because if you have solid classroom practices in place and you're regulated, you are really on your way to being a trauma-informed classroom. There is this self-assessment tool you can see here. I highlighted in yellow. I have a hand trimmer, so you can see it. My yellow line is a little wiggly. On the bottom left, that's the button you're going to pick, Classroom Practices Observation Tool. And what it does is it takes each one of these practices and gives you the opportunity to self-assess about how you're doing with that practice. So I want to give you the suggestion that you could have your teachers self-assess, and then you could provide professional development based upon the results of that self-assessment. So especially if you're a high school, do not do professional development around classroom practices if you haven't asked them first. It doesn't go well. So I had a large high school realize that they needed to focus on behavior specific praise. They didn't do a survey with their staff. They had kids, they had like people in Santa costumes, and it was their last PD before Christmas, and they were just eaten alive because it was insulting to people that, why are you telling us how to give praise? We already know how to do this. So you want to be really sensitive to asking first. So the first practice, we're not going to go over all those practices, but the first practice I want to go over to really integrate the trauma piece is establishing and teaching expectations and rules. So we know that our rules have to be defined very clearly early in the year. And so if you are brick and mortar, all your expectations have probably changed because there's masks, there's hand washing, there's 6 feet distance. And if you are hybrid, then kids need to know what the expectations are remotely, and kids need to know what the expectations are brick and mortar. And so we have to get really clear. Make sure that your expectations and your information around this goes back to whatever your 3 to 5 big school-wide expectations are, like safe, respectful, responsible. Make sure you're connecting everything. We know that those need to be positively stated. The sign at McDonald's does not say, wait until you get to the window to dig in the bottom of your purse for your $7 Diet Coke. There's a sign that tells me what they want me to do, and that's what we want to do with kids. We need to make sure they're posted. So virtually, what we need to do is make sure we post at the beginning of our class periods. We need to have those up and reviewed every time. They need to be taught directly. They need to be things that are reasonable and functionable, and you need to be able to observe and count them. So we know that this kind of system where we have very clear rules and procedures gives structure to kids, and it can help them be engaged. For kids who've experienced trauma, this means that they know what to expect. And when they know what to expect, they will feel safer, they will function more from their upstairs brain, and they will have a better time with learning. Kids who've experienced trauma thrive from established expectations. When we have high expectations of kids, it tells them what we think that they can do it and they're worthy. When my boss gives me a project, what he is saying, or she is saying, I have 2, what they're saying to me is, Amy, we think you can do this. We have confidence in you. If they just only toss me like minor projects, then I would think they think I can only do minor projects. So we have to make sure that we have high expectations We don't want to lower our expectations for kids who've experienced trauma. That would be a mistake. We want to have high expectations of kids who experience trauma. We need to make sure there are predictable rules, and we need to be predictable as adults across the building so that we can have an environment that is feels safe. So let's talk about some strategies about how you would actually do that. So here is a school-wide teaching matrix. So I'm sure you all know this. In a PBIS building, you would be expected to have 3 to 5 school-wide expectations. Those are on the left. This school chose to put expectations for teachers at the bottom. I wouldn't do that as a team. I would survey your staff to have them tell you what the expectations should be. And then across here, you have all the settings and one that's just covering all the classrooms. So you can see here that being respectful means we're on time. And I want you, I think it should circle this. Oh yeah, 3 to 5 school-wide expectations. So that's, we're going to define what respectful, organized, and responsible looks like in every environment, clearly defined. And so when we, I'm fascinated with these arrows. I forgot they were in there. When we do this, what we're doing is we're creating the social, emotional, behavioral standards for our building. This is what we expect of all kids. This is what we expect of all teachers. And I want to point out to you that there are trauma-informed strategies on here. So giving kids the opportunity to have a quiet or social lunch area is a way to help kids who feel overstimulated. Inviting kids who are sitting alone at lunch to join you is a way that we help kids understand what it's like to be kind, inclusive. Using breathing techniques at lunch and listening to your own personal signals is one of the ways that this school taught kids how to act. And they taught them how to do breathing activities or breathing practices. They practiced them, they used them in class, and then kids would know how to use them in the lunchroom and listen to their own signals. Oh, that was a good social media one right there. For the online section, check my feelings before I post. So that would have been a lesson we taught kids. So we don't just tell them. There's a difference between telling and teaching. Teaching, you cannot tell me algebra over the intercom. It will not work. You have to teach me how to do algebra, meaning, why do I have to know this? Let me watch you do it. Let me hear you explain it. Let me do it and you give me feedback. That's what teaching means. Telling over the intercom is just a good reminder. You could remind me what you taught me, but we're going to have to teach every single thing here on this matrix. And as I mentioned, the matrices are going to be changing because of the pandemic. So this high school had an entire column on what to do when you feel upset. So what that means is they would have taught all of these skills. And if you're in the boat of, I didn't sign up to teach these kinds of skills, I signed up to teach X, then we probably have to reevaluate, because honestly, we live in a world where kids have to be taught this. You don't have to go to very many places and communities to realize that, you know, sometimes kids don't know to say hello and thank you. When you've just dropped $200 on groceries and they don't speak to you, like, that's a skill problem. That's a skill they've missed. And whether we like it or not, it falls in public education now. So there's a blank matrix for you. What I would encourage you to do is to think about expanding your vision on your matrix, either pandemic matrix or brick and mortar hybrid, or I would encourage you to look and see what social skills you are encouraging and teaching kids to do that are part of your expectations. So is the expectation every day, what's your expectation for Zoom every day when kids jump on? And make sure we're teaching them that. I think we just have to focus on that even more than usual right now. So teaching lessons around behavior doesn't have to take long at all. It doesn't have to take an hour. It can take 10 minutes. And there's a sample one in here for you, but I think what I want you to think about here is, I want you to think about behavior lesson plans being simple enough that a teacher could get an email, read it, and teach it 5 minutes later. It cannot be complicated. It needs to be very straightforward and simple and manageable and doable. And while we're at this section, it is super important that we don't drop what we're doing for social emotional standards in our building, even when we're remote. If you're teaching second step lessons, you should still be teaching second step lessons remotely. That's going to take some systems work and some conversations, but that's something we really need to pay attention to. So I'm going to give you a second or two here to take a peek at these questions. And I'm going to take a breath. Okay. So we just talked about that if you have solid classroom management practices, you're on your way to being trauma informed. There are lots of different practices. We just focused on the rules piece with your classroom and building wide matrix. That's all we had just covered. And now what I really want us to pay attention to is the routine piece, because I'm going to challenge you to add some things to what you're doing if you aren't doing them yet. So we teach routines like how to sharpen your pencil, what to do in a lab experiment, how to go to the bathroom, how many pumps of soap. Like, remember that saying earlier, clear is kind. So we want to have all of that taught, those kinds of routines taught. Routines are just procedures that become habits. So that's trauma informed because it helps kids know what to expect. And it increases our prompts of possible changes as a teacher or an educator. It will help us do better at giving prompts if we're going to make a change. So here's where I really want to challenge you today. I really want to challenge you to add teaching routines for brain regulation, self-awareness, and relationships in your curriculum. So doesn't have to be all at once. Could be a tiny amount, could be just talking about how you're going to be doing it. This is going to take some systems work to get this done, but we want you to consider, to be trauma informed, we want to make sure that there are routines in every location for brain regulation, self-awareness, and how we're relating to kids. So let's talk about some strategies for each of those. So here are the three, if you wanted to see them visually, that I just talked about. We're asking you to consider having routines for these three items. So here's an example of having a routine for self-regulation. Everybody in our building, every day, does a regulation activity between transitions. We used to, at alternative school, we would do a regulation activity at the end of PE before kids went back to their classroom, because it was like a zoo if we didn't. So we put a relaxation, like a progressive muscle relaxation activity at the end of PE. And then they went to their room, and then they had a couple of minutes of regulation at the beginning of class. So we're not talking like 30 minutes here. We're talking 4 minutes, 2 minutes in the end of PE, minutes at the beginning of the first class. We could also get in the habit in a building that before we are going to teach some important, complicated, hard lesson, that we do some sort of regulation activity to get kids' brains primed to learn new information. Just as a reminder, you have to be functioning from your upstairs brain to learn. It is impossible for you to learn and maintain new skills if you're functioning from your lower brain, from your downstairs brain. This is going to help just restore some equilibrium. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So, and before we go, I'm going to show you an example of this virtually, but relationships, regulation, and self-awareness. This is a teacher who decided, I'm just going to take on all three of those, and I'm going to start making that, like, I'm going to weave it throughout my day. So she decided she was going to work on relationships by greeting kids at the door. And I have a handout for you about that virtually, or the 6 feet thing. And then they were going to do a regulation activity about 10 minutes after the kids got settled. They do a writing STEM activity every day. So why couldn't we have the writing STEMs be about self-awareness? And after lunch, kids need some regulation after PE or after lunch. And before we teach a math lesson, we're going to do the regulation. And our daily gratitude journal that we do in my class, we always do a journal at the end of our class, and now I'm going to make that a gratitude journal. So this isn't tons of time. It'll take time to plan, of course, but you are probably already greeting kids at the door. You're probably, if we're struggling, we're probably spending 10 minutes getting kids corralled. We're already doing a writing STEM. They already come back squirrely after lunch. They're gonna learn more, which is obviously our goal, if we help them before a hard lesson. And they're already doing a journal at the end of the day. It's about weaving these routines in. So this teacher decided to do Monday, Tuesday, Friday. So relationship self-awareness on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. She did brain breaks after PE. And Friday at the end of the week, she wanted to have her kids feel connected before they went home, because so many were going home to places where there wasn't connection at that point. So she wanted to focus on relationship and self-awareness with the hopes that it would help them over the weekend, and then they would come back on Monday. Here's an example of a teacher who did themed days, and she incorporated relationships, regulation, and self-awareness into all these themes. So we focused on rules, having the matrix. You teach everything on your matrix. I'm challenging you, if you haven't already, to include some social, emotional, behavioral wellness expectations onto your matrix. And of course, we have to teach those and practice them. And then I'm challenging you to take your routines, and I'm challenging you to build routines for regulation, relationships, and self-awareness. So let's talk a little bit. Remember, we're about routines, but I'm going to share some other regulation activities here. So we know that focused attention practices are a way to quiet our minds. So first of all, I'm guessing you already know this, but focused attention practices is what we say when we can't say meditation. That's the way we don't have to deal with people thinking that we're practicing religion at school. But focused attention practices, there's a bajillion of them, will help us control our behavior. It will help us stop and think. It can help us organize and plan, and it can help us stay in the moment, which kids who've experienced trauma need to stay in the moment as much as possible. So that's a regulation strategy. Breathing practices, having quiet time, having quiet movement time, focusing on colors and sounds and tastes, all of those things can be great brain breaks. And I think most educators know and use brain breaks. I'm just challenging you to make it a routine so it's expected and done regularly. So one regulation strategy is that we create a space in our classroom for regulation, for calming down. So some people call that the calm corner. Some people I know in Indiana called it the amygdala first aid station, because they taught all the elementary kids in their building what the amygdala does. The amygdala is the size of an almond. It controls your fight, flight, and freeze. It tells it's the watchdog of your brain. It tells you when fight, flight, and freeze needs to happen, or some way to step out in the hall. And then having a signal, I need regulated. So the thing I want to make sure is that we don't use this punitively, that we've given kids time to practice it, and we've encouraged kids and provided some specific praise when they do use it correctly. So those are just examples of more regulation strategies. Babies breathe naturally from their belly, and that's where you breathe when you're relaxed. When you're relaxed, your breath is coming from your belly, not from your chest. So diaphragmatic breathing means that our belly would be soft. Deep dive breaks is a regulation strategy where you teach kids how to inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. See the deep dive picture there? Somebody asked me what that meant. I was like, that's the deep dive. There's a 5 things activity. I've worked with adults and kids who learn this strategy and find it very helpful. In the middle of a stressful moment, identify 5 things you see, 4 things you feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, 1 thing you taste. Kids can learn how to do this. And then when you see Matt beginning to escalate, sorry, your picture's right there. When you see Matt starting to escalate, you can walk by Matt and say, Matt, do you want to practice our 5 things strategy right now? And I'll come back in a minute and check and help you out. Like, you want to be, thank you, Matt. We want to be in the position where we've taught them and it's just part of what we do in our building and in our classrooms. The Feel My Feet activity, and I'm going to point you to a great resource here. So Lori Desital, whose name is down here with an active link in your PowerPoint, she has tons of regulation strategies for priming the brain for learning. And I would suggest that you take a peek at those if you aren't already doing this really often. So we want a routine for regulation. We want a routine for self-awareness. So how do you teach kids self-awareness? Well, first we have to know that we have self-awareness. And you can do that through things like emotions poster. You have to make sure that you're addressing the different backgrounds that kids are coming from, and it needs to be consistent across all classrooms. So my hope is that you don't have zones of regulation in 2 rooms. My hope is that if you're going to use the zones of regulation program, that you have that across the building and it's part of your tier 1 work. It's not a PBIS tier 1 team and a zones of regulation team. You want those all to go together. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. Here's some other self-awareness strategies, making sure that you use your journal prompts to encourage self-reflection, meaning how do you feel about something? When you're reading a story, make sure that you're having prompts about how the characters feel and what the emotions might be. When we debrief with a student, we're actually teaching them self-awareness. When we debrief with an entire class in a circle format, we're totally teaching self-awareness. When we have morning restorative circles, we're teaching self-awareness. So there are lots of ways to do this, and it isn't about doing 1 million of them. It's about what would fit in your context and is doable for your teachers. And now we want to make sure we have some routines for relationships. And I would really encourage you to, well, the circles is a great way to teach self-awareness. It's also a great way to work with relationship strategies. So we have put a morning meeting link in here from a responsive classroom, and then Edutopia had a good article, we linked it there. And I would suggest to you that if I didn't put it in here, but it's in the PowerPoint that Heidi is going to show you how to get to, we have a YouTube video about how to run a morning meeting virtually. Or how to run a circle virtually. And I would really suggest you check it out. It's really not that complicated. It's just really transferring what we do in restorative circles at school onto our virtual platform. So this document, Heidi's going to give you a link to. So this is a document that will be posted on the national website, isn't posted yet, but has been vetted. And so we have it on our website, and Heidi was going to put that link in there for you. But how do you stay socially connected while physically distant? So we need to teach, we need to identify a couple of these. What are we going to use in our building? And what's that going to look like? How are we going to teach them? So instead of a visible smile, we go all Tyra Banks and smize, right? Smile with your eyes. Or you use an emoticon, or you say out loud, hey, Kate, I'm smiling because you're so engaged today. One of the lead researchers around the faint response, his name is, I'm gonna get it wrong, Stephen Porges, yes. And he talks about how generally all of our emotions are read from here up, which is not what you would think, right? You would think that your mouth was a big part of that. But honestly, what he's found is that it's more here up. So if you're going to do some Botox, don't do too much, because we still need to be able to read your forehead. No shame, no blame, just know we're going to need to read your forehead. So here's another example of relationship strategies. And I think most teachers probably do this already, but get the holistic view of kids. So ask them questions about their life so that you can refer to these when it's possible. If you have 100 kids you're working with, this is going to be maybe not your strategy. But this is going to allow you to say, hey, Heidi, I know you have allergies to everything outside. How are you doing today? Or Kate, hey, Kate, I don't know if you know this, but Kent's also a Cubs fan. So you're helping relationships. Or Ellen and Julie both love dogs, so I'm going to pair them together and get them started together. So basically, we're just trying to do things to help kids feel connected to you, and a relationship strategy is a great way to do that. The 2x10 strategy, I don't think I have in here. I think most people probably know that, but that's the strategy where 2 minutes, 10 days in a row, you connect with a student about something non-academic. So the kid that we all have kids we don't really enjoy. So the kid you don't really enjoy, do the 2x10 strategy and help build a relationship with them. We can also build relationships with our families through surveys. As I mentioned earlier, I would suggest that you make sure that you're asking families how to survey and what to survey. So instead of us deciding, we actually inquire before we do it. This is a good one. So Lori Desital, the woman I mentioned earlier, so she's from Butler. She's done a ton of work on trauma in schools. She lists classroom professions. You know how you have somebody who is the line leader or the paper collector, or I just lost any ideas about what that would look like virtually. So we'll see if I can find it in a minute. But her ideas are that you make them more about relationships than about tasks, or you just add them to the task jobs that you have. So you have somebody who's in charge in your classroom for giving out random acts of kindness sheets, or you have somebody who's in charge of storytelling. You have somebody who at the end of the day you can say, hey, Denise, show me, tell everybody in the room what went right today, so that you're helping create self-awareness and you're helping build relationships between you and the student and between the students. She also includes the kindness keeper, the resource manager, the collaborator. I think virtually this is probably going to be more about having kids keep track of certain things, like how do we do with, I'm making this up, obviously. How do we do with eye contact? How do we do with the chat today? How did we do with saying nice things to other kids? Those kinds of, in that realm of doing this virtually. There's a slew of relationship strategies online. We just included some of them. Things like the hot and cold game. If you need to have some time in your classroom for a routine for relationships, the hot and cold game builds relationships. Copycat builds relationships. Board games build relationships. There are tons of them. We want routines for them. So we want to have a matrix for our rules. We want to include social, emotional, behavioral health. We want to have routines for everything, but we're challenging you to add routines for regulation, relationships. It just left my head. We want to have strategies for regulation, relationships, and self-awareness. Sorry about that. It just left. So we want to have routines for all three of those. So the next classroom practice we're going to touch base about is that you have a continuum of response strategies for inappropriate behaviors. So another way to say this is we all respond to problem behavior the same way. We have a toolbox in our building and we all use them. So here's what happens. I think this is maybe a high school example, but teacher A lets everybody, the school rule is no one eats in class. Teacher A is like, I don't care if you eat in class. They're hot Cheetos, whatever, it's fine. Just make sure you do your work. And then teacher B on some days is okay and some days isn't. And on teacher C's room, we follow the school rules. So not only is that not good for kids who've experienced trauma, it's also not good for those three teachers, because what's happening is we're unintentionally pitting teachers against one or the other. And teacher C, the one that follows the rules, has to do triple time to have a relationship with a kid. Because the person who's like, yeah, eat hot Cheetos all you want, is going to be more popular and it's going to be easier. But we don't want to do that. We want to have consistency for kids in a trauma-informed environment. And that means we have a response to how we do that. We know we need to have a continuum because one response isn't enough. And I think we probably all know that. Our strategies should be based on a growth mindset, meaning that we know it can get better. When we have a continuum of strategies, that is being trauma informed because it's empowering students and teaching them resiliency skills. We want to build their resiliency skills. It's also replacing poor behavior with correct behavior, and it will help kids get regulated if we're doing all the same thing across the board. So here is just an example of maybe what yours looks like, and maybe it looks a little different, but we want to have a continuum of strategies for inappropriate behavior. Every PBIS building more than likely has this in place. And I want to focus on regulate, relate, and reason because it might not be in your continuum of strategies. So we're challenging you, thank you, we're challenging you to put regulate, relate, and reason into your continuum of strategies. So the 3 R's, regulate, relate, and reason, are an idea, I guess, coined by Bruce Perry, the researcher, but he's really the one who talks about it. It's cited down there at the bottom of your slide. So we think that we could become more trauma informed if we help kids get regulated and calm their stress response, and then they connect with us, and then they can reason. So what I'm talking about is in the moment when a kid is having a challenge, demonstrating a challenge behavior that of course is not personal but feels personal, is demonstrating a challenging behavior, we think the 3 R's need to kick into gear. And that means we're going to get the kid regulated first. So if you talk to a kid about their behavior when they're not regulated, what they hear is wah, 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 right? And sometimes it makes it worse. We don't want to talk to kids when they're not regulated. We want to give them strategies and space. We want to make sure that they get into their upstairs brain so they can think, so that they can process, so that they can know cause and effect. So the first thing we do is make sure we're regulated and then they're regulated. These are the same strategies that I talked about before. I just want to hit home again. When you teach regulation strategies to a class, you have to practice them regularly, routinely, so that kids will practice them in the moment, so that you can refer to kids, so you can refer to them when kids are kind of having a challenging situation. Having the regulation plan in place is an alternative to someone telling you to calm down. I'm not sure when the last time your loved ones told you to calm down, but I know in Springfield that doesn't usually go very well. So we can say things like, you seem really agitated, or how about I come back to you in 5 minutes and make sure you're okay? I can see this is really hard for you. Is it okay if I sit with you? Saying things that are going to help calm down instead of rapid fire questioning or any questioning. They have to be regulated to think clearly, to process, and to know cause and effect. So instead of saying things like, I can't do anything right, the kid says, the adult says, that's not true, you do all kinds of things right, right? Well-intended, but actually creates a little conflict inside little person or big person. Validating that would be, it's got to feel frustrating for you to feel like you don't do anything right. So this kid in this example feels like he can't do anything right. And when you say, oh, I can do when the kid says, I can't do anything right, and the adult says, that's not true, cognitive dissonance happens. It's just like a clash that happens. We want to validate what they're experiencing and then move on to be able to teach them the skill they need. So in the continuum of responses, we're talking about regulating and then relating. So once a kid's regulated, we need to do something to help form meaningful connection. And one of the best ways to get a relationship together is let me say that again. One of the best ways to relate is to do a regulation strategy together. So when you're working to relate with kids, we have to remember that kids who've experienced trauma sometimes set intimacy barriers and boundaries, and they may use extra fun words to establish some distance. So what we're after is relational wealth, because kids who've experienced trauma often come from an environment where there's relational poverty. And we know that a history of relationships is one of the best predictors of a kid's social emotional wellness in the future. So we need to make sure that we remember that 15-second interactions with kids can change the way their brain is wired or the way their brain is developing. I just mentioned that regulating is a great way to do that. So once you've regulated, you and the kid, and you've made a connection, then it's time you can reason with them. So that means that we can do some inquiry, we can do reflection sheets. So you can do things like dual thought sheets where you fill it out together. It's where you can use restorative questions. So this would mean everybody in the building uses restorative questions and has that kind of philosophy that that's how we're gonna handle this when we're in the reasoning mode. So those 3 R's are something that you have to talk about and have to be system-wide. And there has to be some buy-in from your administrator. So if you have an administrator who is, okay, so let's just say for a minute, you work in a building that's punitive. I don't think that probably happens in Wisconsin. It does in Illinois. But in Illinois, we have some buildings where the function is be punitive, be punitive, be punitive. And the way we start with them, it may surprise you. The way we start with them is about self-care. Because we can get to talk about trauma if we talk about self-care. And if we can talk about self-care and trauma, then we can talk to them about how kids' brains actually work and why it doesn't make any sense to ask a kid when they're escalated, what's wrong? Why did you do that? I know you can do better. I saw you do that yesterday and you did fine. I know you know that that's wrong. Those things make it worse. And so we want to be in the boat of everybody getting on this page. And that's, that may be lifelong systems work. So I would encourage you to take the self-assessment or ask your teachers to take the self-assessment without their names on it. And I would then compile the information. And I would then look at providing some professional development around whatever they tell you is needed. And if you've already done all the trauma work, then you want to start helping them understand how trauma if you're regulated, having strong classroom practices in place is the way to work into being trauma informed. And the challenges I have put forth today are that you would include social emotional wellness on your matrix. So not just procedures. That you would add routines for regulation, relationship, and self-awareness. And that in your continuum of responses to inappropriate behavior, you would add the 3 R's: regulate, relate, and reason. Together, all the strategies that we've cited in this PowerPoint in our modules. So they are all listed and they're all cited either on the slide or at the back end of the PowerPoint. So every single strategy touched on is listed here. Because sometimes, I don't know about you, but I leave a training or a session feeling like, I don't know if I got any strategies. And we want to make sure that you're walking away with some strategies. You may not be ready to use them, but you might be ready to investigate them. So, and then we have some additional sources. I would encourage you to remember these 3 things. This needs to fit within your framework. It's not separate. 2, I would encourage you to get social emotional behavioral skills on your matrix. And I would encourage you to get the 3 R's as part of how you respond in your building and district to problem behavior. Everybody needs to know what happens with kids' brains when they are in the stress response. So those are the 3 things I hope you walk away with today.
It's a perfectly timed question. So this is a question from Danielle. The context is this is coming from a middle school that teaches the coping corner and some self-regulation strategies from the start. And Danielle's wondering, is it harmful or is it helpful to quietly let a student know that I see that you're not self-regulated. Maybe it's time for you to go to the coping corner or the calming corner and practice some of the self-regulation. So she's just wondering if you could just provide some, expand on that a bit.
It's such a great question, right? Because you could offer them that strategy and that could be super helpful. I think honestly, it depends upon whether or not kids see it as punitive or not. If kids really do see that as an opportunity to calm down, like there's something back there in the calm corner for them to do that they enjoy, that helps them calm down, then that would probably work great. But if they see it, we have a lot of schools who do some things where teachers send kids to the back of the room or they send kids to other rooms to calm down. And it's not therapeutic, it's punitive. It's like, that's your last shot, get back there. But that's not what we want a calm corner to be, right? So I think it's fine if you can make sure you're differentiating between it being punitive, which means you could never use it punitively. You could also, if you have other strategies in place, you could help buffer that a little bit by probably offering 2 strategies like, hey, I see you're getting kind of upset. Would 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 be a good idea? Would calm corner be an idea? What do you think? And maybe giving them a choice could be really useful. But again, you'd have to have practiced 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 a lot for the kid to be able to do it on their own. I do have a teacher who did, she let every kid go to the calm corner whenever they wanted at the beginning of the year. Like, just go to the calm corner, because she wanted to make it part of their room. And she wanted to make sure kids knew that it wasn't punitive. And at first it was a little wild, but then it settled down and kids really stopped going to the calm corner unless they needed it. So I think it all depends upon the approach, but I think you can do it. You just have to make sure it's not punitive.
Danielle, does that address your question? Thanks, Amy.
Sure.
So one of the questions is when we consider what this virtual world might be like for some schools, can you envision what like a virtual circle format might look like?
Yep. So here's how I learned this. That YouTube video in our PowerPoint that Heidi put in the link to. But basically, so you know how you set up norms and rules for your circles, like your morning circle, like we talk one at a time, whatever your rules are, you set up the new norms with your kids on Zoom or whatever platform. And then because you don't have a talking stick on Zoom, you have an order that you always go in of who goes next. You always have the option to pass. You can still use questions like, I'm not sure a good morning message, like, how did your morning go? Can be a question, probably not the first one, but down the road. Or let's all talk about one thing that we liked about the lesson yesterday on X, right? Just questions that are going to get kids talking and connecting with one another. So then it's exactly the same. It's just, you just moved it over to Zoom. So in order, set the norms and rules, and have questions, and always have a wrap-up activity just like you do in your circle. So I know that makes it sound too simple, but that's really the gist of it.